Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Codex. So we have a lot to talk about. We, of course, had the DevStream 181 that happened recently, and paired alongside that, we have three new developer workshops that I want to primarily be going over. In the background, you'll see some gameplay of the new frame Kome that I pulled from the DevStream 181. You can kind of see how her four abilities work and the kind of fate-bending theme that she has. If you look in the bottom right of the screen over there, you'll see that she has 5 dice that she rolls every time that she casts an ability. And if you roll triple sixes or better, I assume, like, so if you roll 3, 4, or 5 sixes, you get a buffed version of whatever ability you're casting. She seems to be very status themed as well, with the luck themes, like luck and stats effect, because multiple of her effects seem to be applying statuses and buffing the amount of statuses that you get. So that's interesting. For example, her in regards to the dice buffing, if you roll triple sixes or better on her ability, where you put the Omamori or Omamori, whatever it's called, charms around yourself, that ability right there you see on screen, those charms around you, typically those just give you a chance to be healed instead of taking damage from enemy fire. But if you roll triple sixes or better, it just makes you completely immortal instead, as you can see on screen right there. So that's interesting. So it's kind of some RNG built into her kit, although it's only in the positive direction. You can't get a negative roll. So if you get Snake Eyes, for example, it's not like, oh, you got the lose all of my energy debuff, sucks to suck. Like, that's not how it works. It's either just like the neutral, normal, positive effect of casting the ability, or it's an even more positive buffed effect, depending on whether or not you get that triple six roll. Anyways, on to the dev streams. Rather the workshops that they released here. We have one on the Caliban and Nova rework, or at least that's the title. There's actually some Wukong and Hildren details in there as well. Then we have the companion rework and the new player experience and quality of life changes and buffs and whatnot. Let's go over the Caliban and Nova first. So starting off with Caliban, they are definitely making him a lot better. We'll have to see when he actually, like, when the changes actually come out, if it's enough to really bring him into the limelight. One of the main things that they're changing is that they are normalizing what the Tau damage type and stats effect actually does. So they're essentially adding it to the game and really solidifying it with detail. So the Tau stats effect inflicts status vulnerability, similar to Dante's page flight effect, for example. And if you have 10 stacks on the enemy, it's 100% status chance of vulnerability, because it's 10% chance per stack, and each stack lasts for 8 seconds. So Tau damage is now actually added to the game, essentially, as a real thing, and it has its own status effect. And currently, it's only Caliban, Tenno-wise, like on our end-wise, that's actually able to utilize that, so it does add a little bit to the idea of him having more of an actual identity as a Warframe, so that's good. His first ability, Raise It. Well, first let's go over the passive. So Caliban's passive is essentially completely unchanged. They didn't change the numbers of the effect of his adaptive effect, but they did slightly buff it by allowing it to stack while you're immune, which is also how the actual adaptation model works. So if you are immune from shield getting, for example, but you're taking hits from enemies, you're still able to stack up that resistance, whereas that didn't work before. So his first ability, Razor Gyre, currently it's one of the worst abilities in the game. It does effectively nothing. It's the absolute helmet fodder of his kit. They're changing it to be a utility and somewhat of a health and energy sustain effect instead. So instead of you just kind of whirlwinding around, now when you cast Razor Gyre, you'll fly forward. You'll still be spinning and you'll hit enemies, but they've changed it now to where it's much more of a mobility tool. You really shoot forward, and to every enemy you hit, it will heal you, but if you're at full health, it'll instead give you shields, and if you're at full shields, it'll instead become overguard. So depending on where your defenses currently are, it'll either refill your normal defenses or overflow into overguard. So it's pretty good. You also get a little bit of an energy refund for each enemy hit. So if you hit a decent amount of enemies, depending on how that works, it can maybe even work like Nidus's first ability, to where it's actually a positive energy economy. So like if you hit enough enemies, the energy refund that you get will actually exceed what you spent, and you'll actually gain energy rather than lose any, or even be net neutral. So that's interesting. They did also increase the damage of it. That's kind of an across the board thing. They made basically all of his abilities actually do Tau damage, apply the Tau status effect, and have a higher base damage scaling. So just keep that in mind. I'm just going to be mainly going over the actual mechanical changes, but along with the mechanical changes that I mentioned, everything does more damage as well. So they also changed Sentient Wrath. The major buff they gave it was that they removed the limitation on the amount of enemies that could affect. Thank God. That was the worst thing about that ability. The actual effect that it has, which is a damage vulnerability, is actually decent. It's okay, and it's, you know, like a lifted crowd control. But they changed the two main issues, actually, of this ability, where one, they removed the cap on the amount of targets it could affect. That never made sense in a horde shooter-based game. And they also made so that now the lifted enemies, they won't be, like, floating around in a way that's really hard to actually hit them, especially if you want to land headshots. They're now going to be directly lifted and held steadily in place, similar to the Hydroid Tentacle Swarm rework. So it'll be really easy to actually shoot those enemies. Also, they made it to where, along with the base 35% damage vulnerability they receive, which still, of course, scales with power strength, they also get a Tau status effect applied to them, which is, again, that 10% status chance vulnerability per stack. They didn't specify the amount of stacks that it gave them, so I'm just going to assume 1. So if it just gives them 1 stack, that means that on top of the 35% damage vulnerability, it also now applies at least a 10% status chance vulnerability on top of that, which is another buff technically. They also increased the ability casting speed by 25%, so it's a bit less sluggish to cast, which is fantastic. Lethal Progeny, which is his ability where he summons down his sentient companions, basically, also got a large change, a huge quality of life buffs, and mechanical and damage buffs. So, again, all of these summons will do way more damage. I'm not going to go over all of the distinct damage numbers, but just keep in mind they all do more damage. They, instead of now just being the Conculus that you summon, you can summon 3 different kinds of sentience. Also, when you cast the ability, instead of having to cast it repeatedly to get all your summons, now a single cast will bring down all of your companions. Now, the main change is that it's the 3 different kinds. You have the Conculus, Ortholist, and Sumulus. So Conculus, they were changed. They no longer give you shields. They now instead are super melee-oriented, higher damage units. And the main buff, sorry, I'm running out of breath here. Whew, so much talking. The main buff is that when you cast your Fusion Strike, all of your Conculus will also Fusion Strike at a half effectiveness, so basically half stats, as your main Fusion Strike, and they will target the same area. So basically you can land 4 Fusion Strikes in one zone, which is essentially guaranteed armor strip, and a large damage increase from your 4th ability. The Ortholist is essentially a Tau damage artillery unit. They will set themselves up kind of farther away, and they will turn into like a turret artillery style, you know, howitzer mode, and they will just launch Tau status lobs enemies with 300% status chance in the mortar form, so they can apply anywhere from like 1 to 3 status effects, depending on if they're moving around or they're in their mortar form. So they'll just be stacking that status chance vulnerability on enemies. And the Sumulist is now the new one that is, it basically took the place of the old Conculus and beyond, to where it's now the one that gives you a ton of shields. The Sumulist is like the portal sentient, where it doesn't really do anything on its own, but it sits down and it turns into a portal, and it summons Corylus, like a lot of them. And each Corylus active will increase your shield regen per second, so that's the one that will keep you alive. They also specifically said that the Corylus are forced to have the highest enemy aggro pool available, so as long as there's Corylus on the field, enemies will be, it sounds like, forced to attack them instead of you or any other allies. So that's also a little bit of survivability in the sense of enemies won't be shooting at you actively. So unless you're taking AoE damage, you basically won't be taking damage if the Corylus are on the field, it sounds like. Fusion Strike buffs. So the Fusion Strike was changed to where the actual beam itself is what ticks the armor strip, rather than having just the explosion and the field left behind the strip armor. So you can get multiple ticks of that armor strip per beam, so depending on where the enemy is in your beam radius, you don't actually need to have 100% armor strip to strip an enemy, because, for example, even at just the base 50% strip, if they're hit by 2 ticks, that would mean that all their armor is gone. So yeah, so that's the major change about that. They did, of course, like I said, they bumped up the towel damage, again normalizing that. So that's most of the changes for Caliban. He does sound a lot better. I'm interested to try him out, and I will, of course, have a dedicated video covering him, after those changes are actually live. Now, quick note about Wukong and Hildren. So Wukong, TLDR, they're nerfing the Slam Kong meta. You will now have to wait until the heavy attack animation has actually fully played out before you're allowed to go back into Cloud Walker. So no more Cloud Slam, Cloud Slam, Cloud Slam, Cloud Slam. No more animation canceling via Cloud Walker is really the only changes they're doing. So I'm not gonna lie, it was probably needed. That that meta was pretty dominant, and if you use that in a mission, it is hard for other people to actually be able to compete with that. And it is, of course, a very unintended playstyle that's somewhat exploiting the damage of heavy attacks by being able to spam them like that, because the animation that plays out after a heavy slam is kind of part of the balance of a heavy slam. Like it's what that actively keeps you from spamming it because they can be so strong. So being able to get around that is not really the intended playstyle. So I understand why they're doing that. Hildren changes, on the other hand, are the opposite. It's entirely buffs. They are reducing the overall cost of using her Balefire. They're making Balefire be automatically equipped when you go into Aegis Storm, which it probably should have done that in the first place, but I'm glad they're doing it now. They're also letting you now cast abilities while you're in Aegis Storm besides Balefire, which is really nice. They're taking that from Jade, for example. Jade's able to cast stuff. So like you can cast your Pillage while you're flying around in Aegis Storm, assuming you don't helmet that ability off, which we probably all still will do. But if you're using it, it is now better. Balefire charge, the charge shot also does a lot more damage now. It's 1500 base damage is the new number, and it only costs 200 shields for a max charge cost. So those are the main changes for her. Now Nova, the Nova changes. Oh boy, do we have some good Nova changes that came out of total left field. Did not see any of this coming. I don't think they mentioned Nova getting any changes at all, so this was really just dropped on us like boom. So her passive is much better now. Her passive currently is, it's like whenever you're knocked down, you knock down enemies within 6 meters of you or something like that. And as they rightly mentioned, that means that if you're knocked down immune, like if you're using Prime Sure-Footed, the passive is useless. I mean, the passive is always useless, but it literally cannot work if you're knockdown immune because it only triggers on knockdown. So now they changed that to where enemies that are killed while they're slowed by Molecular Prime have a 15% chance to drop health orbs, and enemies killed while sped up have a 15% chance to drop energy orbs. Now, the fun fact about that is that they changed Molecular Prime to no longer have the bipolar scaling. It's no longer negative strength for speed and positive strength for slow. They both now scale off of positive strength, and you can now be a slow and a speed Nova because they changed Molecular Prime to a hold tap ability. You tap for slow, I believe, and you hold cast for speed, which I would highly recommend reversing that when she gets this change, by the way, because probably most of you are usually using speed Nova, so I would invert that so that you can just tap for speed and hold for slow, because you probably use slow less often. So that's an amazing change. That means that you could potentially just have one build for speed and slow Nova. And that also means that speed Nova can also now utilize the effects of having positive strength regarding if you put a helmet ability on her, for example, that wants positive strength like Roar or Nourish or anything like that, for example. Now, Nullstar also got, basically all of her abilities got buffed, TLDR. Nullstar is also recastable by default rather than needing the Neutron Star augment, which is incredible, and they massively buffed it by increasing the base particle count from 6 to 12. Now, the other stats didn't change. You still only need 18. It's still 5% DR per particle, which means that you need 18 total particles at least to get that 90% damage reduction. But now that the base value is 12 instead of 6, that means that you only need 150% ability duration instead of 300 to cap out the damage reduction, because currently, if you want 18 stars, that you need 300% duration because that you need 3 times 6 equals 18. With 12, you just need 12 times 1.5 equals 18. So that cuts the duration you need by 150% to max out the damage reduction. So it completely changes the way that you're able to build Nova and still get the max defensive benefit out of her, which is incredible. Uh, yeah, so that's amazing. Also, the Null Star damage resistance now applies to shields and health rather than just health, which means that, for example, primed redirection is now a real contender for putting on a build on her because she has 370 base shields just like her health, but she has very little armor. She has less than 300 armor, which means that her shields are actually tankier because shields have 50% innate damage resistance. So, for example, if you threw on like Prime Direction and Arcane Aegis, and now that the DR applies to her shields, she could be pretty shield tanky. So that'll be interesting to try out. That'll be another video that I look forward to doing. Now, since Null Star is now recastable by default, they had to, of course, change the Neutron Star augment a little bit. So here's what it does now. Recasting will cause remaining particles to seek out enemies and then replenish the particles orbiting Nova, which means that now in a single cast, they fly out and they recast rather than having to tap it to explode them and then tap again to actually get them back. It's now just one cast, so that's really good. And now the heat damage and guaranteed heat proc now apply to all Null Star particles, not just the ones sent out via recast. So the Null Stars that naturally fly off of you will also get that heat bonus rather than only on detonation, so that's interesting. Antimatter drop. This one changed to where it's... I'm not sure if they changed the damage of it because that's not really clear. They didn't mention it, but they changed the speed of it. I think the base speed might be slightly faster based off what I saw on the dev stream, but also after you throw out your antimatter drop, and you can only put out one now, by the way, instead of two. You can only have one at a time. When you put out your antimatter drop, they said you can only shoot it 5 times to charge it up, so I assume that means that 5 shots will fully charge it. It's either 5 shots like guarantees a full charge, or you only get 5 shots to charge it. If it means that you only get 5 shots, then that means that some weapons will be better than others because you'll want higher bait. I don't know. We'll have to see. But the interesting thing is that if you recast while it's active, it like flies away. So if you are annoyed by the way it currently works, where you throw out your antimatter drop, and then it takes a while to get to your actual target, you can just tap it, and it will zoom at them and basically instantly explode. So that's really interesting. Now the Wormhole now has infinite duration. It's charged base, so you can put that on Wormhole, and if you don't use up all the charges, it'll still be there half hour later, basically. And it has an indicator like a diamond indicator above each portal, showing you how many charges it has left. So very interesting there. Molecular Prime. This is what I mentioned before. Again, it now just scales off positive strength. Another thing they changed is that the base slow/speed effect has been buffed from 30 to 50%. An interesting thing about Nova is that currently she doesn't seem to scale properly multiplicatively with power strength like every other frame in the game does. Because, for example, currently her base slow effect is 30%, and yet you only need 145% strength to max out the slow at 75%. Now, for those of you that understand basic math, you'll know that doesn't make any sense. You should need 250% strength because 2.5 times 30 is what equals 75, and yet you only need 145. And an interesting note is that 30 plus 45 is 75, so it seems like she scales additively 1-to-1, where like 1 strength is 1 extra slow, even though that doesn't make sense when you start at 30%. So maybe with them going to 30 to 50%, they're also going to change it to be properly multiplicative, which if that's the case, then you would need 150% strength for the max slow/speed effect. Another huge damage buff is that the double damage multiplier that Molecular Prime applies now works on Overguard and shields and health rather than only health. It currently only doubles your damage against health. Now it's going to be health, shields, and Overguard. So everything that you're shooting will take that double damage. So that's just a direct damage increase. So that's absolutely amazing. And they changed the Molecular Efficient Augment to... this is just a straight buff. It still works the same way, where getting kills will refresh your particles, but also Null Star will apply Molecular Prime to enemies struck by its particles. So when your particles fly off, it will apply the slow or the speed effect and the damage debuff to enemies that it hits if it's not already on them. So that is super interesting. Now moving on to the Companions rework. This is another, everything I just said, there's so much crazy news even just in that first one, and that's only the first of 3. So now we're on the Companions rework. So a lot of this is beast oriented. They did rework Sentinel rifle weapons, but a huge thing here is that each of the beast type companions, which is basically the organic companions, they now all have distinctly different damage values. So all of the Kubros, Parasites, the Kravats, and the Vulpaphilas, each kind of each of those companions has different base damage, different status chance, crit multiplier, so they have more of a identity regarding the amount of damage they do. They've also changed the AI, so typically at the moment, companions will kind of be all over the place. Sometimes it won't be that useful. If they are attacking somebody, it could be somebody you can't even see, things like that. So if they, even whether they are or aren't being useful, a lot of the time you can't even tell because they're not even near you. Now the AI for the pets they'll be trying to basically stay in front of you and lead you, and they'll prioritize attacking enemies that are actually in your field of view, especially directly right in front of you. So they're trying to change the companions to be more clear as to what they're actually doing, essentially. Now, the charm change, that's what a lot of you want to know about. They are changing / nerfing charm depending on how you currently play the game. So they have completely removed the resource buff from charm entirely. It's not gone, though. They turned it into its own new mod called Loyal Retriever. Loyal Retriever provides a passive 13% chance that each resource or credit pickup that you grab will be doubled. They said that they chose 13% because it's like roughly the statistical average based on the amount of time that the current version of Charm would be active. So I don't know. We'll have to see that. The thing about that is that depending on how you play the game, that is a nerf, because if it's a 13% chance to just double things that you pick up, the way that Charm currently works is that it's a 2-minute long buff, which means that you can potentially wait for Charm to activate. So if you were like a Steel Essence farmer to where you would kill an Acolyte and then you would let the Steel Essence sit on the ground, that would be statistically a higher chance of getting the current Charm to go off rather than this. This one's not time-based. It's just when you pick something up, you have a chance of it being doubled. So it is better for the overall health of the game, most likely. The idea of letting loot sit on the ground is not really the intended playstyle for Warframe, kind of waiting around to double your resources, for example. So I understand why they're doing that. I'm sure we'll be fine in the long run. They did buff the affinity buff from Charm from 2x to 3x affinity because the affinity portion of Charm still remains. And in fact, speaking of Charm overall, regarding the other effects, has been buffed because it's now a 40% chance to activate every 28 seconds rather than a 27% chance, 28% chance. It's like a 28% chance right now for it to activate every 27 seconds, I think it is. It's now 40% chance. And for example, 10% of that time will be the bonus affinity buff, which again has been buffed by 50% essentially from 2x to 3x affinity. So that'll be good for focus farming, for example, or leveling up frames and whatnot. So that's interesting. Now, speaking of the Loyal Retriever mod, you know how I said that was 13% chance to get resource and credits doubled? So they did also add more specialized mods, where instead of a 13% chance for both, you can instead get the Prosperous Retriever, which is specifically an 18% chance to double only credit pickups. Only credit pickups. Or Resourceful Retriever, which is an 18% chance to double only resource pickups. So if you want to, and I'm assuming that based off of how mods usually work in Warframe, you can't have multiple of these Retriever mods on, since they all are blank Retriever mods. They're all the same kind of mod, like how you can't have Fury and Berserker Fury on. You can only pick one Retriever mod. So most of the time, I imagine, people will be running Resourceful Retriever for that max 18% chance to double resources for things like Cuba, Steel Essence, regular resource farming, etc. Now, they did also add a bunch of damage mods to companions, and we can actually fit damage mods on our companions now because they're giving organic the beast companions their own claw moddable weapon slot. So they're moving all of the current damaging mods like Bite, Maul, Frost Jaw, Venom Teeth, etc. Those are no longer going to be equipped on your actual companion. They're going to be equipped on its claw weapon that you can separately mod. And along with that, there's also all of the new damage mods they're adding. They're adding, for example, Icy Inclination, plus 300% cold damage and plus 300% status chance, and all elemental damage is converted into cold. They have a mod like that for each base damage type. So cold, heat, toxin, electric, impact, punch, or slash. And they all do that same kind of thing. So that's interesting. The part that's going to be that I'm going to be most interested in, I think, is the new melee posture mods. These are going to be kind of like stance mods for the claws that change the way your companion work. A lot of them are different kinds of damage buffs. If you just care about your companion staying alive and buffing you, a lot of people are probably going to be interested in the pacifist training mod, which says your pet will not attack unless they strike it with a melee weapon first. That wording kind of confuses me. It says your pet will not attack unless they strike it with a melee weapon first. I'm assuming that either means if the enemy strikes them with a melee weapon, or it's a typo, and I meant to say if you hit an enemy with a melee weapon, because I'm not the wording's just a little confusing. But the fun effect about this is it also gives your companion a 50% evasion bonus to help keep it safe. So with the pacifist training on, your companion will basically dodge 50% of incoming damage, which will just make it much tankier essentially. And that's probably what I'll be using, so I like that quite a bit. Now, all of the, well, not all, almost all of the Sentinel weapons, basically everything except the Verglass, because it's already amazing, are getting buffed across the board. So higher base damage, status chance, crit damage. They have, like, all of them listed here. I see Artax, Burst Laser, Cryotro, Deconstructor, Death Machine, so on, so on, so on. Basically everything, like I said, except the Verglass. Buffs across the board, very good. So we're getting new mods, we're getting Sentinel weapon buffs, we're getting reworks on existing mods, which in fact, speaking of that, some of the Precept mods are getting reworked. Of note would be the Shade mod, Ghost, for example. Currently, when you're not near enemies, the invisibility that mod gives you just instantly ends. There's now going to be a 3-second grace period. So if you're moving from like pack to pack, you won't instantly become visible and mess up your stealth. So that's pretty good. They're increasing the range of the looter mod for carry from 12 to 22 meters, so that's just a better loot mod now. If you still are using Smita after the charm change, they did buff Mischief to also now blind enemies within 8 meters once your decoy is destroyed. Here's perhaps the best one on the entire list. The Negate mod for the Worm Sentinel, which, for those that don't know what that is, it allows your worm to basically make you immune to one singular status effect at a time, and then it goes on cooldown. Here's the buff. Allows Manifold Bond cooldown reduction to apply to Negate's cooldown timer. So Negate will now be affected by Manifold Bond, which means that you can much more reliably get that status immunity if you're using a Manifold Bond setup. So that is a very good change. I definitely like that. Now let's go on to the final workshop here, which is the new player experience and quality of life changes. So a lot of this, the new player stuff obviously won't apply to you if you're not a new player anymore, like if you're a veteran, for example, or even if you're in the mid-game. If you've already gotten out of what you might call the tutorial of the game, a lot of these changes won't matter to you. The TLDR is that they're improving the flow of the beginning of the game, including the quest flow, even more. They're streamlining things, for example, incubating your first Kubro and how the Kubro now only takes 1 minute instead of 48 hours. So it's now a minute instead of 2 days. That's a lot of the kind of stuff they've been doing, where they're making these starter quests not have these waiting periods of multiple real-life days just to progress through what is essentially the tutorial of the game. So that's fantastic. I like that quite a bit. Now, in terms of quality of life changes that affect everyone, there are some really good changes here. For example, the unowned mod views. The unowned mod view in the codex will now show their full description and drop locations. Currently, if you go look at your codex, and not this codex, not me, the codex in the game, guys. If you go look at the in-game codex, at a mod that you don't have, it doesn't give you any information, essentially. It's just blanked out and it has question marks. Now it'll show you the full name of the mod and where and how to actually get it. So the codex is now actually a codex. So that'll be fantastic. Now, in selling an unmastered item from your inventory will also display a pop-up message recommending that you rank up the item to level 30 or level 40 if it's one of the items that can go to 40, for like cube weapons, for example, before attempting to sell it. So that's basically just something to avoid you making a oopsie mistake and wasting mastery and then having to go back and rebuild that item later. So that's fantastic. Now, also, when you unlock a new ability under Warframe, you will see a pop-up on your screen, and it says for the example they gave was on Steinax, for example. You unlock Theros Strike, and it'll say ability unlocked, Theros Strike, press 2. So it shows you the name of the ability and what button to press for it to go off. Because if you're a new player or a person who's playing a new frame, you might not have all the names memorized, so you might not know what Theros Strike actually is. So it's now telling you Theros Strike is one of this frame's abilities. You've just unlocked it, and it's activated using this button. So it just makes things more clear, essentially. Now for newer players, or actually I think this only turns off at MR30 or higher. So yeah, when a piece of equipment in a loadout has 10 plus unused mod capacity, you'll get like a warning icon now, unless you're MR30 or higher, because I guess they assume by that point you should probably know how to mod and, manage your weapons. But if you're 29 or below, it'll give you a warning for stuff that has too much unused capacity, so that's useful to make sure that you don't accidentally leave half your mod open with no mods, for example. Now here's one of my favorite ones. Void relics will now display owned and crafted status of possible rewards. So now at a glance, when you go to your relic segment and you look at your relics, you'll be able to see parts that you both already own and have already crafted. So that's kind of bringing over some of that Aleka frame style convenience, for example, if you guys are, familiar with that program that some people use. We can also now favorite equipment in the arsenal, so if you want to favorite those 7 Murellis that you've built and put them all at the top, you can now do that. So if you're like, I typically use this fistful of Warframes and this handful of weapons and these companions, you can now favorite all of them. So when you go to those arsenal lists, they'll all be at the top. So you won't have to scroll or type them in. They'll just always be presented to you first thing. So that's really nice. They're kind of streamlining the mod fusion screen. When you're leveling up a mod now, it's going to have its own different looking, better looking screen, basically. You can also now level up mods directly from your arsenal by right-clicking, it looks like. So you don't have to even go to that separate mod view anymore. That's really nice. What's another? There's a few I'm skipping up here, smaller stuff, like some settings and whatnot. Another great one, purchasing arcanes from a vendor now displays how many arcanes you own per rank. So for those of you that aren't aware, if you have a max rank arcane and then you go to buy more copies of that arcane from a vendor, that max rank copy you have, which if it's a rank 5 arcane means that it's 21 put together, will only say 1, because it views a max rank arcane as 1 arcane. So the number that you see that you own isn't actually really the full amount that you own if you're thinking about like how many rank 0s you have. So now it'll show you the amount you have of each rank to make that more clear, which is super nice. We're also going to have Steam auto login. So if you're a Steam Warframe player, which is most PC Warframe players, we finally won't have to type our password in every single time that we log in. You can bind it to your Steam account, and then you can enable auto login so that when you launch Warframe, it'll now automatically put you straight into the game and essentially skip that login screen. That is incredible. So that's most of the changes, guys. I did skip over, like I said, some of the smaller stuff. If you want the full details, make sure that you go and yourself read over these 3 dev streams. I will, of course, have all of 3 of these links posted down in the video description. These are amazing changes. Basically, the only thing you could argue here that could technically be a nerf would be the charm changes, depending on how you farmed. Although I think overall it's better for the health of the game, and it's more convenient, and I don't really have a problem with it. It's fine with me. I do think that it's going to help with variety moving forward. Oh, and the reason that it's going to help with variety, just in case I didn't make it clear, those new retriever mods that give you the chance for double credits and resources, you can put them on all beast companions. It's not just the Smita. Like that's why they made it a different mod. So you can put it on your Panzer, for example. Now, it still only is for beasts, though, which I do find a little annoying. I feel like they should have just made all companions so that we could really have full variety, because they took it off of the Smita and gave it to all beasts, so it's no longer if you want to have extra resources, you feel like you're forced to use the Smita. But now it's still if you want to get max resources, you're just forced to feel like you have to use a beast. So it's still limiting you in what you're able to use if you want to get max resources, because you still can't use it on sentinels. So that's interesting. I'm kind of hoping they change that in the future. But overall, like 99%, these changes are fantastic. The Nova changes especially are insane. Super interested to see what you guys think. Let me know down below, what do you think is like the best part of these changes? And maybe what's the worst? Like, what do you not like about these changes? Is there anything that you don't like? Anything you're not looking forward to? I think it's fantastic. This update's going to be coming out on Wednesday. You can catch me on Twitch, definitely, hopefully on Wednesday and the days following. I'm going to be, of course, playing through the new update. I'll do the quest. We're going to grind out Kome, her new weapons. We're going to see how all the changes fare. We're going to get that Nova video out, Caliban video. Going to be doing a lot of content for you guys. Anyways, hope you guys are having a great day. Hope this video helped you out. If it did, consider dropping a like and sub. Really helps out the channel. And I will see you guys in the next one.